What is freedom? Does what it means to be free differ across cultures? In the West, we take individual freedom as one of our highest values. Our entire political systems are organised around giving the maximum possible individual freedom, most exemplified in the freedom of the individual to pursue his own idea of the good life, as Michael Sandel puts it. This, maybe most notably, includes the freedom of the press as a pillar of society and a necessary component of democracy. The ongoing dialogue of the critique of government, the fourth estate, which is why authoritarianism and censorship in China, an increasingly educated and developed country, can seem so antithetical to our values. Especially in an increasingly connected world, where it seems like the freedom to express oneself online will be increasingly unable to be controlled by a state that governs over 1 billion people. In 2012, China came 187th out of 197 countries on press freedom. In 2018, that has only marginally improved as 176th. The most frequent and obvious targets of censorship are anything resembling independence movements in Tibet, protests over democracy, and events like Tiananmen Square, where in 1989 pro-democracy demonstrators were massacred. Official Chinese figures put the death toll at up to 300. Declassified files and reports from foreign journalists at the time, though, suggest this number could be anything up to 10,000. With such widespread censorship, it would be a fair assumption that the goal of censors would be to prohibit and silence any criticism of the one-party state, the Communist Party of China. But interestingly, this isn't necessarily the case. To really understand the strategies and aims of Chinese censorship, we need to understand the cultural differences explicit in Chinese philosophy, culture, and history. But first, let's look at how the press and the internet is structured in the country. The largest newspapers, like the People's Daily, are state-run. But in a country of over 1 billion people, it's impossible for the state to completely control what's printed in smaller newspapers and publications. And that's before we even look at the internet. Online internet interconnecting networks must register and connect through one of 3 gateways in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, which regulate and filter the internet at the top level. Below these 2 tiers, service providers also filter and block content, and users register to gain access. These tiers also employ around 300,000 Internet Police Force officers to monitor internet use. Non-state news websites can operate after receiving authorization, but other general interest websites may not post news from their own sources. Foreign news must not be published without official approval. So sources must be approved government media operations. Facebook is blocked and replaced by Renren, as is Twitter, which is replaced with Weibo. The firewall which stops foreign websites and data entering the country has been dubbed the Great Firewall of China, but rather than this being a flippant pun, the analogy between the digital and the analog walls may be more telling than it seems on the surface. The press engages in what's called self-censorship, or risks hefty fines and prison sentences. But the explosion in ways of posting information online begs the question, what is news? A magazine about pets could have an article dubbed news, and a social media post could also become news. Where's the line? And what guides censorship and self-censorship? Author Jingqi Zhao puts it this way. With the growth of an affluent middle class in China, young Chinese consumers are not especially concerned with politics, but are enthusiastic about participating in websites that give them opportunities to express their thoughts and opinions regarding lifestyles and trends. So when does a really bad restaurant review become news? When does a social media post about a bad film become a critique of Chinese politics? Satire, for example, is popular online in China. A video called Murder Caused by a Bun spoofs a recent film called The Promise in a way that criticises the international influence on the Chinese film industry at the expense of the influence of local Chinese culture. This, of course, is political. It is news. But it's allowed by the state. What complicates the issue further is that counterintuitively, Chinese citizens are overwhelmingly supportive of censorship. Although, of course, it's hard to discern how much of this might arise from fear of telling pollsters otherwise. And not only that, being on the right side of the party and joining the party brings huge personal gains to Chinese citizens. To understand all of this, I think we have to understand that Chinese tradition, culture, history, and philosophy, grounded in Confucianism, is wildly different to that of the West. Confucianism is a tradition of Chinese ethics and philosophy that centres around the teachings of Confucius, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries BC. Where Western tradition and philosophy is grounded in and emphasises individual freedom, Confucianism is largely grounded in the very opposite, an emphasis on the community and the family. A strong paternal attitude is central to Chinese culture. The Western attitude to liberal individualism is, for the most part, centred around the belief that you should be free to do what you want to do. This is what Isaiah Berlin called negative liberty. You are free from others' influence. So the state, for example, can't force you to do something. Confucianism centres around what Berlin called positive liberty, which means the freedom to. It involves duties to others. For example, healthcare is a means to enjoy more freedom through good health, mobility, longevity, etc. But this is not a negative freedom, a freedom from interference. It's a positive freedom because someone has to provide the healthcare. Someone has to have a duty to provide you with something to make you more free. Negative freedom is simply standing out of someone's way. So Confucianism emphasises duties to the family and the community over the individual's personal freedom. The community, the head, the ruler, looks after the individual. Li Sanghuan puts it this way: liberalism's excessive emphasis on individual rights may have such undesirable consequences as economic disparity, rampant materialism, fetishism, and moral decay. Meanwhile, Confucianism's emphasis on paternalistic caring may have an undue effect on an individual's free will and capacity for autonomous decision-making. From this perspective, a social ideal that respects nothing but individual liberty is liable to neglect the equitable distribution of wealth, while one that stresses the common good alone runs the risk of authoritarianism. At the turn of the 20th century, as China was getting a footing as a modern nation, the Chinese philosopher Lin Kuei-Chao visited America and became concerned about what rampant individualism does to a community. His scholarship would influence many after him. For Kuei-Chao, individual freedom was important, but if a clash arose between communal and individual values, saving the nation and state building would take priority. Confucianism places a premium on harmony between the individual and society, but the idea of a private realm, free from the influence of outside forces, is something that didn't really exist in China until it was imported from the West in the 20th century. It's through this lens, placing the common good in a cohesive society before individual self-interest and heterogeneity, that we can understand the Communist Party's approach to censorship. One recent study found causation between a parent's adherence to Confucianism and more conforming and authoritarian personality traits in later life. And in a 2013 study, Gary King and others at Harvard University analysed posts on Chinese social media sites. Surprisingly, they found that criticism of the state or the party did not increase the chance of a post being censored. What did increase the chance were posts aimed at collective action, movements and groups, a threat to the party that would splinter the country. In other words, true to the Chinese tradition, the Communist Party prioritizes unity and homogeneity of the community over individual freedom when a clash between the two values arises. Confucius said that a virtuous person has strong self-respect, but does not dispute. He lives harmoniously in his community, but does not form factions. Of course, this attitude simultaneously has the effect of protecting the Communist Party, and it's difficult to know whether the protection of the state or the protection of the party motivates these policies. It's most likely both, but it doesn't avoid the fact that totalitarian regimes have always resorted to similar arguments when persecuting minorities and trampling on individual freedoms. So it's not to say that trying to understand the Chinese attitude to censorship is equivalent to condoning what is sometimes a violent and oppressive regime. Both the Uyghurs and the Tibetans are denied any political identity in China. But of course, China is a vast and varied country. Polling of attitudes and academic research is not always accurate, and it's not always possible to gauge the authenticity of people's opinions on a subject. While it might have widespread support, many protest against and reject censorship, both offline and on. Black bars, for example, unregistered internet cafes with relaxed rules, are popular. One estimate in 2003 puts their number at 110,000. And they are subject to constant crackdowns. It is, though, important to understand the sources and justifications for a state's attitude and the philosophical and historical reasons for potential support. To understand the philosophical foundations of Chinese policy is to be better able to criticize it, and we may just learn something about our own culture and philosophy at the same time. If you want to support Then and Now, then please subscribe below, and most importantly, click the bell here to receive notifications when I upload a new video. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram in the links in the description below. And if you're feeling really generous, then this channel only exists through the support of pledges on Patreon, where you can support new content with as little as $1 for each new video. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.